something on the chat channel, I will see that at least. Thanks a lot for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be able to present here. Also, hello to Giuseppe, who just wrote me in the chat. He's an old colleague of mine from Ghent. Nice memories. Okay, so the title of my talk is Reasoning and Explaining with Norms and Defaults. So it will be a lot about default reasoning. So we developed a framework in recent years, especially together with Kees van Berkel. This is basically the framework I will present today. But then I will later on go into a bit of advanced topics. That depends a little bit how time goes. But that will be then things which I did together with Ofer Arieli and also with Seng Su, a PhD student from Beijing. So let's see. So, but first I want to talk a little bit about reasoning with defaults so that we all start from the same starting point. So what does that mean? What are defaults at all? What are default rules? So default rules you all know from everyday reasoning, like you have birds typically fly, or after the colloquium, we usually go for burgers and pizza. Sci-fi fans are typically pro-science, etc. So these are rules which typically hold, but sometimes there are exceptional circumstances when the conclusions of these rules may have to be retracted. So a knowledge base which features default rules could look something like that. So I will use now these strict arrows to indicate strict rules. So these are rules which don't allow for exceptions, and the double arrows for default rules. So what we know here, for instance, in these knowledge base here graphically represented is that Wilma is a sci-fi fan and Wilma is an environmentalist, but sci-fi fans are usually pro-science and people who are pro-science are usually pro-nuclear, but environmentalists are usually not pro-nuclear. This is indicated by this dashed arrow. So these are typical scenarios with defaults. As you can see already in the simple example, they sometimes lead to conflicting conclusions. So what to do when we have conflicting conclusions? We need some refined reasoning methods. And of course, we are in 2024, so logicians have been thinking about that for a long, long time. And one of the most prominent systems is Reiter's default logic. So let's shortly talk about this a little. So how would Reiter reason with this conflicting knowledge base which we have here? And the basic principle in default logic is really the principle of applying modus ponens to these default rules as long as we consistently can. So what would that mean here? So first of all, the strict rules, they always apply. So we know Wilma is a sci-fi fan and Wilma is an environmentalist. But now we apply default rules one after the other until we run into a conflict. So for instance, now we reason that she is pro-science because she's a sci-fi fan and therefore she's also pro-nuclear. But if we apply this default, we cannot apply the one down here because that one would lead to an opposite conclusion. So this is how Reiter builds up so-called extensions. So by applying modus ponens as much as possible, we can reach different extensions. So we could have, instead of applied this upper default, we could have applied the lower one. So we get a second extension. Extension simply tells you what you can infer given such a maximal set of defaults which you have been applying in this greedy manner. So in this case, we have simply two extensions. And if you wonder, what should I conclude now, given this knowledge base, then you simply intersect all of these extensions. This is called the skeptical inference. And so we can, for instance, infer that she's pro-science because that was not part of the conflict, that she's an environmentalist, that she's a sci-fi fan, but we neither can conclude that she's pro-nuclear nor that she is against nuclear power. So this is a typical scenario in default logic. But default logic is not the only player on the market. There have been other systems which have been proposed to reason with defaults. One is so-called input-output logic, which is often used for deontic applications, but it has also been used for causal reasoning, for instance, by Bochmann in a new book also. So it's also a very prominent framework on the market, and it works somehow differently. So how does input-output logic work? In a nutshell, what it tries to do is to reason with maximal consistent sets of defaults. So instead of having this greedy detachment mechanism, what it does is basically try to identify sets of defaults such that if we apply modus ponens to them, we are still consistent. And if we would add another default to it, we would become inconsistent. So what would that mean in our scenario? It's easy. We only have 3 defaults, these 3 here. So we can basically combine always 2 defaults and have to leave 1 out. So we get to 3 different families. Family 1 is default 1 and default 2. Family 2 is default 1 and default 3. And family 3 is default 3 and default 2. Now, interesting, if you contrast this here to default logic, then you see here a difference. This family 3 here doesn't correspond to an extension in default logic. If we would be greedily reasoning, then we would, because of sci-fi fan, we would first want to apply default 1 and then later on go to default 2. In this case, if we identify maximal consistent sets, we can also choose default 3 and default 2. And that gives us an additional extension. Having an additional extension, now what we do when we want to define what are the consequences, we do the same as before. We do skeptical inference, that is, we intersect all the consequences which these 3 families gave us, and that's what we infer. So in this case, we lose now suddenly the pro-science inference. So as compared to default logic by writer, input-output logic is a little bit more cautious. It holds back on this one inference here. This is the one we got in default logic. So there are slight differences between these 2 mechanisms. So in a nutshell, writer's default logic is greedy modus ponens, and input-output logic is reasoning with maxicon sets, irrespective if the of the fact whether the defaults which are selected in this max families are triggered or not. That doesn't matter in input-output logic. So these are 2 paradigms of reasoning with defaults. Okay. Now let's look at one particular problem I will focus a little bit more on later, and that is the problem of disjunctions. So what if we have disjunctive information? Disjunctive information you typically have if you are somewhat underinformed. Maybe we don't really remember about LUCI, whether she was an environmentalist or a creationist. So the only thing we remember is, yeah, she was one of the 2. We also know that environmentalists are typically against nuclear power, and creationists are also typically against nuclear power. Now, neither of these 2 defaults here is triggered because we only know the disjunction. She's environmentalist or creationist. So what do we do in such a situation? So the solution proposed in input-output logic, at least in the syntactic approach, is the following: to use meta rules for input-output pairs or for default rules. So if we know the first default, the upper one, and we know the second default, then what we can do is we can conjoin these 2 bodies of the 2 defaults, so environmentalist and creationist, in a disjunctive way and get a new default, a third default, which allows us to infer not nuclear from the disjunction of environmentalist and creationist. So this is an interesting and very elegant way of treating the problem of reasoning with disjunctions in a default setting. In writer's default logic, there are other proposals how to do that. So one goes back to Gelfand and Lifshitz, and it's kind of the standard approach. It says, okay, if you have this information, what you do is you consider each disjunct separately, and then you get different extensions. So first disjunct is environmentalist. So we consider it now separately, and then we get, okay, LUCI is not a supporter of nuclear power. Same with the other disjunct, we consider it separately, creationist, and then we know that LUCI is not a proponent of nuclear power. Now we have 2 extensions because we considered the 2 disjuncts separately, and now we bring everything together again and reason skeptically on the basis of these extensions which we just created. And therefore, therefore we can conclude skeptically that she is not a supporter of nuclear power because this was concluded in every extension which we got. So basically we dissect, whenever we see a disjunction, we cut into pieces the information we have, and then we reason separately, and in the end we put everything in one pot together and reason skeptically. So that's also an elegant solution. However, it runs into some problems. So here is a problem. So let's say we know about LUCI, she's in the Green Party, and we know that she is a member of Extinction Rebellion. So Green Party members are either, they either follow the police of Realpolitik, that's the German word for being rather conservative and pragmatic about decisions, or she is a grassroots member. So we know that grassroots members, they are in favor of banning diesel, while people who are into realpolitik, they are not into banning diesel. Extinction Rebellion members are also by default into banning diesel. Now, if you follow this strategy as just proposed by Gelfand and Lifshitz, what we do is we cut this disjunction into pieces. So we first consider that it is true realpolitik, and then we consider it is true grassroots. However, now, if we consider realpolitik, then we can't anymore follow this default from Extinction Rebellion that if you are a member of Extinction Rebellion, you usually don't follow the pragmatic realpolitik. And that seems rather counterintuitive, because I think in this example, I hope you agree, but we can discuss a bit about it. It seems quite intuitive to say that he is for banning diesel on the basis of her being for Extinction Rebellion. So actually, we should apply here disjunctive syllogism and infer that she is a grassroots member. And that's not really what happens in the account by Gelfand and Lifshitz, unfortunately. So in other words, there are some problems with disjunctions in default logic. Okay, so good. Defaults also have been interpreted in many different ways. So the title of my talk was talking about defaults and norms. And the norm interpretation is one of the two interpretations of defaults. What you have been seeing so far was rather the doxastic interpretation. So this is about enhancing our beliefs. What should I believe given a set of facts and a set of default relationships? This is the traditional approach by Reiter, Newt. Bochmann talks here more about causal relations, but it also falls into this doxastic camp. The deontic camp considers defaults rather as conditional obligations, so as norms. And this is the approach, for instance, by Horthy in default logic, or by input-output logic, by people like Van der Tore, Xavier Parent, and so on and so forth. So there are ways of interpreting these defaults in with different applications in mind, doxastic applications or deontic applications. Okay. Good. So what are the challenges concerning default reasoning? And some of these challenges I will try to tackle now. So let's shortly go through them. What have we seen so far? So first of all, we have seen this disjunctive reasoning is still a little bit problematic, at least in Reiter's default logic. I will later on argue it's also problematic still in input-output logic. So the meta rule or is not always the best, but we will see about that. The other thing is, so if you think about defeasible reasoning, or if you read on literature on defeasible reasoning, it's very often cashed out in terms of argumentation. So if you go back, for instance, to Toulmin's book, The Uses of Argument, 1958, a big criticism of formal logic. Why? Because formal logic can capture defeasible reasoning. Defeasible reasoning should be thought about as the exchange of arguments, as defeat. So it's an argumentative style of reasoning. Also in cognitive science, some people argue that reasoning is argumentative in nature, Mercier and Sperber, for instance. So argumentation seems to be a rather natural way of thinking about defeasible reasoning, but it's not so obvious what's the connection between input-output logic or between default logic and argumentation. So can we characterize these two forms of dealing with default information? Can we characterize them as forms of argumentation? And maybe as a byproduct, we get some kind of unification and a way to compare these two systems. I will try to do that in the next few slides. Also, once we have argumentation, the link to explanation seems to be rather obvious, because what is explanation? Explanation is the giving of reasons to somebody who tries to understand why something, for instance, follows from a certain knowledge base. So, and the reason-giving activity is an argumentative activity. I give you an argument. And so explanation seems to be very close to argumentative reasoning. So let's see if we can somehow once we have a framework which uses formal argumentation to deal with default reasoning, maybe we can use this framework also to talk about explanation or to extract explanations from knowledge bases. Proof theory. Can we characterize default logic and input-output logic in a proof theoretic way? maybe in such a way that they are both unified in one and the same system with maybe some variance of the rules, because there has to be some difference. So I will try to give you an account of how this could look like. And then, of course, I already mentioned that defaults can have two readings, a deontic one and a doxastic one. So can we combine these modes of reasoning in one and the same framework, where we deal with conditional norms on the one hand and with traditional default information on the other hand? Okay, so let's do this. So defaults in logical argumentation. So what I will present now is joint work with Kees van Berkel and with Zheng Zhuo. So if you want to read up a little bit on that, there is a COMA paper from 2022, and we have a nice paper which is applying this framework to legal reasoning in Zurich, 2023, with Reka Markovic and Leon van der Torre. So there is some literature out already, but of course we are still working on this. So any suggestions and ideas and discussion is very welcome on this. So what we are doing now is, so I first present you a little bit the language. So the language for defaults, we will use this notation as pairs. This comes really from input-output logic to consider a default as a pair, an input and an output. And as you can see here, I am already thinking about how could we mix the different styles of reasoning. So I want to indicate when a default is a doxastic default, like birds typically fly, and when it is a conditional norm, like if you are a doctor, you're allowed to park here or something like that. Actually, we are talking here about conditional obligations rather than permissions, but nevertheless. Then we indicate factual information with a superscript F, and we indicate obligations with the superscript O. So this is, instead of using modal operators, we do here the simple way of just using labeled formulas, and beliefs we will label with a B. So we can nicely make a distinction between these different types of information. In the context of deontic reasoning, but I will not talk too much about that. We also sometimes use so-called constraints, but let me skip over that. None of my examples will mention constraints. Okay, so what's the idea here? So we want to model reasoning as based on reasons. So reasons should be very much the focus point. So we want to have a model which gives us an easy way of providing reasons for conclusions, and this complex beings where reasons are stated and conclusions are stated are called arguments. You will see an example in a second. And then explaining conclusions should be based on stating reasons and demonstrating how they warrant the conclusion. So first of all, we want to give an argument. If somebody wonders why is something the case, we give an argument for it. But maybe we have to go further. We have to demonstrate why is it a good argument? Why can it defeat its defeaters, etc., etc. That would be explaining. Let me, though, first start with the simple, with a simple logic for dealing with defaults, for reasoning with defaults. So how could an argument look like? For instance, a very basic argument would be an argument based on modus ponens or detachment. Here in this case, it's factual detachment. So if you know for a fact that phi is the case, and you have a default which says if phi then psi, then you should be able to conclude that you now believe psi. So there should be some kind of doxastic commitment to psi given this default. This can, of course, run into trouble. We will talk about defeat later, but by default, you should be able to use this kind of modus ponens argument. So this is factual detachment. The same in deontic reasoning. If this is a deontic, and this is a norm, a conditional obligation, then of course you should be able to conclude that its conclusion is obligated. So this would be arguments which model factual detachment. We also have doxastic or deontic detachment. So if you already believe that phi, and you know by default if phi then psi, then you should also believe that psi, etc. Similar for deontic conditionals. So this is how arguments look like. So we have on the left-hand side, we state the reasons. On the right-hand side, we state the conclusion. And in the middle, we have this arrow. So these objects here in logic, they are called sequence. And what we will do now, we will use a proof theory to manipulate sequence to reasons with sequence. Okay, disjunctive reasoning. How would we disjunctively reason? So if, for instance, we know that we can do factual detachment on this default to obtain the conclusion U, and we can do factual detachment on this default here to conclude U, and we only know that P or Q. How would we do that? Very similar as before. As in input-output logic, we use some kind of reasoning by cases, so we can make a disjunction between the two factual inputs and still conclude the same. So this is how our inference rule could look like, which models something like the OR meta rule, which you have seen earlier on. Okay, so good. Let's see. So let's go back to our example. So this was again the example with LUCI, where we are somehow underinformed. Is she an environmentalist or a creationist? We don't remember exactly what she was, but from both follows that she is not a supporter of nuclear power. So how would this look like in a knowledge base given our labeled language? So what we would have is, on the one hand, we have facts. These are those formulas which are labeled by F for fact. And you see the strict implication or the strict rule here, I simply model as a classical implication. And then we have defaults. And we have two defaults in this case, the upper one and the lower one, and they are written down in the language as I just explained. Okay, so now you could use, for instance, the inference rules you have seen so far in order to conclude. So given that LUCI is either an environmentalist or a creationist, she must not be a supporter of nuclear power. So we should believe that she is not a supporter of nuclear power. How do you do that? You have twice factual detachment, given the upper, here this one, and the lower default. Then you can conjoin them together with reasoning by cases. So you infer the disjunction here. You know that LUCI is one of the two, and then you use the so-called cut rule. So you can combine, you can chain sequence, and you can form this complex argument that she is not a supporter of nuclear power, given all the information we have in our knowledge base. So this works rather nicely. Okay, so, but as I said already, it's not self-understanding that applying modus ponens to defaults doesn't lead to trouble. Sometimes it will lead to trouble. We have seen some examples already where you had conflicts between defaults. So we need to somehow take care of this defeasible nature of reasoning, so that we sometimes have to retract inferences. What we will do, how we will do that is in two steps. On the one hand, we want to use proof theory to generate so-called defeaters, arguments which defeat other arguments. And then we use formal argumentation semantics to select acceptable arguments. So two steps. Let's start with step one. So what are defeating arguments? So the idea here is very simple. If a default is triggered, that means we can infer its condition. But we have reason to believe the contrary of its conclusion, then the default should not be applied. Formally, what does that mean? So here we conclude that this default cannot be applied. Why? Because we know it's triggered. So here it's factually triggered. We have the fact here. And we have reason to believe that its conclusion is false. In this case, the default should not be applied. And similarly for the ontic reasoning, if this is a conditional norm. If we already know that it's not obliged that psi, then the conditional norm that if phi, then psi should not be applicable. So this is how arguments look like which defeat other arguments, very simple ones. Of course, they can have a more complex nature. Let's look at one. So you remember Wilma from our first example. Here we have a conflict. So what you see here is a proof of an argument which expresses what? It expresses that the third default should not be applied. This is this default here. Why should it not be applied? Well, first of all, because we know that Wilma is an environmentalist. Where do we know that from? Here. This is the argument. This is just modus ponens in classical logic. Here we know Wilma, and Wilma implies environmentalist, therefore she's an environmentalist. And we also know that the conclusion of this default 3, we have reasons to believe it's false. What is our reason to believe it's false? This is this argument here. You see, this argument concludes that she supports nuclear power. Why does she support nuclear power? because we have these two defaults here, default 1 and default 2. So we can follow the upper chain of defaults to conclude that she is not that she is supporting nuclear power. So what we get altogether is that she supports nuclear power, this here, and that she is an environmentalist, and therefore we can conclude that this default 3 here should not be applied on this basis here of these two defaults. So this is a complex proof of a complex argument which defeats an argument based on this default, or any argument based on this default. Okay, so good. Let me go on. So I said we do this in 2 steps. So what I showed you now is, in a nutshell, how to construct arguments which are defeaters, so which conclude that a certain default should not be applied. But now, what do we do with these arguments? So what we get is now argumentative attacks. So we can track these argumentative attacks in diagrams, in so-called argumentation frameworks. So what you see here, these are defaults which are derivable from our knowledge base. This F here just means take all the facts we have. And what you see here in the middle, these two here, this is the essential information. These are our defeaters. This is the defeater I have just shown you the proof of. This is another defeater. It says if you use default 1 and default 3, you have a reason not to apply default 2. Why? Because it's triggered. If you use default 1, you trigger it because you get P. And if you use default 3, you have a reason to believe that the conclusion of default 2 is wrong, because now you have a reason to believe not N. So this is the other defeater. And so what arguments are defeated by this defeater? Well, obviously those arguments which exactly use this default, which the argument, the defeater says, is not to be applied. So any argument in this case which uses default 2 should be attacked. So this is this argument, it uses default 2, and this argument, it uses default 2. So we see there's a red arrow from our defeater to this argument and to this argument, and similarly for this. So what we get now is the kind of dialectics between the arguments in terms of what argument attacks what other argument. And this can be nicely illustrated in these attack diagrams or argumentation frameworks, as they are sometimes called. And now, interestingly, there is some theory in formal argumentation how to select arguments out of such graphs. I will not go into any detail because the idea is very, very simple. You want to satisfy specific base requirements. One is that the arguments which you select should not attack each other. So you would never want to select these two arguments, for instance, because they attack each other. What you may also want, for instance, is that every other argument which is not in the set of the arguments you select should be attacked by your selection. This would be called the stable sets. These are conflict-free sets which attack every other argument. And there are many different types of semantics for such argumentation graphs. But this is how we can model defeat when reasoning with defaults. Okay, so if you look at this, if you want to look at the stable sets, this would be one stable set in green here, and the other one is this. Very simple. And if you recall from the very beginning of my talk, this is exactly what the default extensions were in writer's logic. So this is not by chance. As I will show later, we can actually prove that we get in this system exactly writer's extension if we use specific types of rules. I will come to the rules in a moment. Okay, or immediately, because now let's talk about our so-called duck calculi. So the duck calculi, they were originally called the ontic argumentation calculi. Now for this talk, I somewhat renamed them. I hope Kees is not too disappointed that I made this. Now I call them default argumentation calculi, because now I show that we can use this calculi basically for everything I proposed earlier on, writer's default logic and different variants of input-output logic. Okay, so how do these look like? Basically, you have seen all the important stuff already. So we have rules for factual detachment. We have rules for the ontic or the doxastic detachment. We have rules which give us the ability to defeat other arguments, to create defeating arguments. Here I will talk in 1 second about the difference between this rule and this rule, because this is quite interesting now. So all these calculi, which we use in order to represent these non-monotonic logics from the literature, they always use the same base rules, except that we have to switch the type of defeating generating rule when we go from input-output logic to default logic. And I will give you an example why this is different and how it plays out in a second. So ignore now this technical difference. The idea is, though, exactly what I told you earlier. If I know that a default is triggered and I have reason to believe its conclusion is false, then I want to attack it. Okay. Good. Then we have the cut rule. It's very essential. There are other attacking rules. We don't have to go into details. As I said, if you want to read up on this, you can look at our 22 comma paper. It's more about the general idea what I want to present here. We also have calculi to reason with facts, beliefs, and obligations. So for this, we use in the paper simply classical logic. So we use Ganson's LK calculus for that. So if in LK you get that gamma, if gamma then delta, then you can do the same thing with our labels, and similarly for obligations and for beliefs. Of course, you can use another type of logic if you want, for instance, for obligations. There are interesting three-valued logics, for instance, which can make an interesting application for obligations. I think I will not go into details now, though. I will just mention that our framework is fully modular with respect to the base calculi you use for the labeled formulas for facts, beliefs, and obligations. And then the last rule was reasoning by cases, and that one I presented you already. So, okay, so the difference between these two types of defeat rules. So if you look at these two rules, then you will immediately notice that the def1 rule is somewhat more general than the def2 rule. The def2 rule is used for default logic. The def1 rule is used for input-output logic. So what's exactly the difference? In the def1 rule, I have to have exactly these two premises. So I have to know exactly that I know factually that this this body is triggered and that the conclusion of the default is false. For the input-output rule, I don't care really what stands on the left-hand side, as long as I know that what stands on the left-hand side is inconsistent, and that means that the right-hand side of my sequence is empty, then I can conclude that any rule I used in the left-hand side should not be applied. So this is somewhat more general than the def2 rule. So how does this play out in this example? So for instance, one thing we can prove in our calculus with the other rules is that if I apply all the facts and all the defaults, then I have an inconsistent conclusion. You can immediately see that because I get n and I get not n, and that's of course inconsistent. So now with the more general rule def1, which we use for input-output logic, I can now move any of these defaults I used here on the left-hand side, and I can move them with a negation to the right-hand side. So in particular, I can use delta 2 and delta 3 to conclude that delta 1 should not be applied. And that is exactly the one max family which doesn't correspond to a writer extension, because now I use this default and this non-triggered default in order to defeat this default. You remember in writer's default logic, it was based on greedy reasoning. Everything which is used should always be triggered, in other words. So this argument is not acceptable in terms of writer's default logic. In writer's default logic, I can use delta 1 and delta 3 to attack delta 2, and I can use delta 1 and delta 2 to attack delta 3, but I cannot use a non-triggered default to attack a triggered default. That should not be possible in writer's default logic, and that is exactly what this restriction of the def1 rule realizes. So if we look, for instance, now at the argumentation framework, which is generated by def1, then we see we have this one more defeater here, and this one more defeater will generate exactly the one more extension, the one more stable set, which we need in order to characterize our third max family. So we have max family 1, max family 2, and max family 3, exactly corresponding to the stable extensions. And that's simply due to the fact that we use now a more liberal defeater rule. So this is quite nice, because what we are now basically have seen is that by a very tiny switch of one rule in the calculus, we can switch from one paradigm, input-output logic, to an entirely different paradigm, default logic. these two paradigms work very, very differently at their core. Well, default logic is greedy reasoning. Input-output logic is reasoning with maximal consistent subsets. In the proof theory, it's only a little switch to characterize the one rather than the other. Okay, let's sum up. So formally, if you want to describe a little bit more formally what we are doing, so we have a knowledge base which has facts, defaults, and norms, and the arguments which are generated by our DAC calculus, or different variants of the DAC calculus, whether you choose DEF1 or DEF2, etc., or whether you use the reasoning by cases rule or not, this gives rise to different variants of the DAC calculus. But whatever you use now, let's say you fix one variant of the DAC calculus, then you can create this set of arguments which are based on this knowledge base by simply looking at all arguments which are derivable in the calculus and whose left-hand side is contained in your knowledge base. So then you define a text between these arguments by looking at the defeaters and defining a text as I just did above. And then you apply argumentation semantics, for instance, stable semantics. This was my example. And then you can define, just like in default logic and input-output logic, you can define non-monotonic consequence relations. For instance, you can say phi follows from our knowledge base if for every stable set, there is an argument A with the conclusion phi. And you can define variants. You can say, oh, if I can find an argument with a conclusion phi, which is selected in every set A. This should go. This is a more cautious variant of a non-monotonic consequence relation. As I will argue in a second, this consequence relation combined with stable semantics exactly characterizes Reiter's default logic and exactly characterizes the 8 different basic input-output logics, depending what rule set you use for the DAC calculus. Okay, so that's exactly what I said now. So these are the 2 representational results. This one, no, second. This one here you can find in the COMA paper. This is one we will hopefully publish soon. This is ongoing work currently. But what we also get is now we get a variant of default logic for reasoning with disjunctions. Why? Because we can just add our reasoning by cases rule to DAC, and we immediately get a natural extension of Reiter's default logic with disjunctions. So which solves also the problems I earlier pointed out for Gelfond's and Lifshitz account. Okay, so this gives us one variant for default logic for an open problem reasoning with disjunction, but it also gives us cautious variants of default logic and input-output logic, because we can use other variants of the non-monotonic consequence relation, what I showed you a bit above, or we can use different argumentation semantics, like more cautious ones, like grounded semantics, for instance. So we get interesting variations. The result is very unifying, as I explained, by just a minor twist in the default in the proof theory. From def1 to def2, we get a gestalt switch in the representation. We immediately get from input-output logic to default logic and back. Okay, good. So let me see. Time is running, so I will skip this, but I want to talk a little bit about advanced topics. So first of all, so here I will not be able to do all 3 of them, but I will talk a bit more about disjunctions, because this is, I think, an interesting problem. And I saw also Jesse's in the audience, so this is something I already worked with him on. Then a little bit about explanations, and I'm not sure if I will be able to talk about dynamic proofs, but we can do that also in the discussion if somebody's interested. So disjunctions and hypothetical reasoning. This is ongoing joint work with Zheng Zhu and Kees van Berkel, and there's quite some inspiration here. Many of the examples which I will present now, they are based on older work by me and Mathieu and Jesse. So you can see that we wrote, for instance, one nice paper on in the NMR on Pollock and his way of dealing with disjunctions in non-monotonic logic, and there you will see very similar examples. Okay. So trouble with disjunctions. Let me first give you an example to warm up a bit. So let's say we know about N that she's a rationalist. And rationalists are typically pro-science, and pro-science people are pro-GMO. And she's also, so rationalists are also typical environmentalists, and environmentalists are typically against GMO. So this is the structure of the example, which you can see here is often called the Nixon diamond, because you have this kind of diamond structure. If you would make here one node with pro-GMO and here an arrow which is strike through and here a normal arrow, then you get the diamond shape. So it's a very simple conflicting scenario in default logic. And it's pretty obvious, I think, that in this kind of scenario, we should be agnostic about N being pro-GMO, because we have a good reason also that she is not pro-GMO. So this is just for warming up. There are no disjunctions yet, but let's add some disjunctions. So let's move on, and let's say we know actually less about N. We know, we don't remember exactly what she was. She was either a rationalist or a creationist. So if you look at the upper part of the graph is exactly this example as you have seen before. So if she's a rationalist, as we agreed before, hopefully, we shouldn't conclude that she is either pro or against, that she's either for or against GMO food. However, if she's a creationist, we have a default which says then she is against GMO. Now, if you think about this example, I think, so if we do reasoning by cases, if we would assume that she's a rationalist, we should stay agnostic about it. If we assume that she's a creationist, we should conclude that she is against GMO. Now, should we conclude, given that we only know the disjunctive information, that she is a rationalist or a creationist, should we conclude that she's against GMO? I think this would be a rather strong conclusion. I would say we should stay agnostic. However, if you now apply the OR rule, the meta rule, which is employed by input-output logic, for instance, at least some variants of it, then you get the argument that given that she's rationalist or creationist, you get this new default, the one which you can create by the OR rule, that from this information you can directly infer that she is against GMO. And therefore, you in this knowledge base, you will conclude that she is against GMO. And that's way too strong, in my opinion. But we can talk a little bit about that in the discussion. So that seems a very, very strong conclusion to make from this example. So here's another example. So let's say if we have lunch, we usually go for burger or pizza, but it's kind of distributed 50-50, the chance, so we cannot directly conclude that we go for burger or directly conclude that we go for pizza. We only know typically one of the two will happen. So if we go for burger, we typically go to McBurger. If we go to McBurger, we typically have to pay by cash. Similarly, if we go for pizza, we typically go to LUCI. And if we go to LUCI, we typically have to pay by cash. So if you wouldn't know this above here, you would say, okay, then we should conclude that typically we will have to pay by cash. However, I give you additional information. Let's say it's Monday, and on Monday, typically McBurger is closed. So we should not conclude McBurger. Now, if you use the OR meta rule, you can again get the direct argument from lunch to burger or pizza, and from here, from burger or pizza to cash. So you will still be able to conclude cash. And that again is very counterintuitive, because one of the two paths of reasoning here, and namely the one based on the hypothesis burger, has a big problem. It's attacked by Monday. So that seems to overgeneralize. So the OR rule seems to be problematic. So what we want to do is we want to use our proof theoretic framework to reason about disjunctions. And we want to do that inspired by natural deduction. As I already mentioned, I often speak about reasoning by cases. So how does it look like in natural deduction? Reasoning by cases says, if you know phi of psi, and you can prove from phi that gamma, and you can prove from psi that gamma, these are our two cases, then you should conclude gamma. Now let's look how this looks like in defeasible reasoning. Yeah, in defeasible reasoning, the proofs which you have here, they will not be classical logic proofs or some kind of deductive proofs, but they will rather be defeasible arguments. So you can defeasibly conclude from phi that gamma, etc. And of course, as these are defeasible arguments, there is the possibility of defeat. As you have seen earlier, one of the two paths here in our pizza or burger scenario was attacked by the information Monday. So if one of the two paths doesn't work out, then I would say it's quite reasonable to also retract the inference or block the inference to cache. This can be done in our proof theory by a little bit of more machinery. So what we do now is we implement hypothetical formulas. We indicate this again with a label with an H, and we use different reasoning by cases rule. We call this the hypothetical OR rule. And it says, okay, so if you can hypothetically, if you assume that phi1 and you can reason towards psi, and if you assume that phi2 and you can reason towards psi, then if you assume that disjunction, you still should reason towards psi. That looks pretty much like before. However, what we also do is we remember the arguments which we have been using, the hypothetical sub-arguments, which we have been using to generate this new argument, this new disjunctive argument. We remember the hypothetical sub-arguments we have been using before. And this remembering is essential because now we can use this memory, which we encode by these new labels here. We can use this memory to generate more defeats, like the defeat we had in our previous example. So in this example, for instance, we can, like before, we can generate an argument from lunch over this default to cache. So this is, we're using all the defaults except for default 6 in order to create an argument for cache. But as you can see here, I remember something. Namely, I remember that I used this sub-argument based on the hypothesis Berger, where I used these two defaults. And I remember the other path I could take, the one over delta 3 and delta 5. So this is here written down. And that information I can use now, because now I can create an argument based on Monday and this default, which says that this default should not be applied. This is argument A here. It says delta 2 should not be applied, given that it is Monday. And this will now attack this complex argument I built earlier on to infer cache. And it will also attack some other arguments like the hypothetical sub-argument S1. So this is the idea. A attacks S1, and here you see S1 is used, and therefore B is also attacked. So we track now sub-arguments, hypothetical sub-arguments in order to deal with that problem. Okay, so I will not go through the technical details here. I think this is pretty self-understanding, but we can talk about this a little bit more in the discussion. Really, my goal here is just to give you the general ideas, not so much the technical details. Now I think, so okay, now I have to ask you guys, am I already over time? I think so, right?
Oh, you can still finish. Yeah, no, you still have time, don't worry.
I still have time, and I talk probably a little bit about explanation, and then I close there. Okay?
Okay, yes, sure.
Okay, good. Okay, let me shortly talk about explanations. So this is another application of the framework which I just presented. This is joint work with Kees van Berkel. This we also did a little bit in the COMA paper already, and now we are elaborating more on that in recent research. So here's a simple example to warm you up. Let's say we are talking about Princess Charlotte. Princess Charlotte is somebody who usually goes for hunts on Saturday evening. So it's Saturday evening, so you usually expect her to go for a hunt. And if she goes for a hunt, then typically she doesn't dress up. Now, however, today is a ball. And when there's a ball, she cannot go for a hunt, and vice versa. And if there is a ball, then she typically has to dress up. But if she dresses up, then she goes home early because she doesn't like dressing up. So this is our scenario. And now, of course, you can make a nice argumentation framework out of this with your different arguments, etc., etc. But one thing, what I want to talk now about is, what if somebody doesn't really understand why I say you should conclude that Charlotte has to go home early? So how do I explain this to somebody? And there are different ways one can explain this, because there could be different queries which somebody who doesn't understand that could have. So let me go a little bit through how this could look like, because then you will understand why we actually have a quite elaborate framework to deal with explanations. So first of all, for us paradigmatic explanations, they grow out of dialogues between somebody who wants to have something explained, namely the explainee. That person will ask questions and state doubts, etc., and somebody who explains, the explainer. the one who provides the answers. So typically an explanation is not something which is a one-shot, but rather an episode of a back and forth between an explainee and an explainer. So we try to systematize these episodes in terms of explanatory dialogue protocols. So let's first talk about the kind of questions which could come up. And so the first question which could come up is, okay, why should I believe that Charlotte is home early? So why should I believe that in terms of, give me some reasons for that? And the simple answer could be to state the argument. The argument states on the left-hand side the reasons. We know ball, we know certain default relationships, and therefore she should go home early. Okay, that is a very simple explanation. But of course, the explainee could not yet be satisfied, maybe because the explainee might not understand why home early follows from these reasons given. So how so? Why? So the next way of addressing this question could be by presenting a proof. The proof could say, okay, here are some basic inference steps. So factual detachment is used here. Here also, and then I do chaining of arguments, and that's how I arrive at the complex argument. So we break things down to simple inference rules which have been applied, and we show the structure. This is a proof. That's why proof theory is interesting in this context. Another question could be, wait a moment, you state this argument for why she should go home, but you use a certain default, namely default 3. Hey, here is an argument why default 3 should not be used. What do you say about that? So this is somebody who really goes now into the dialectics of the situation. It's not just about support, it's also about why is this a good argument, given that there is a counter argument. And of course, what we should reply in such a case, if we're the explainer, is to have a defeater of the defeater. So we defend the argument. So here the argument could be because there is a ball. Therefore, the default 1 is not applicable. Okay, so, but yeah, okay, that's fine. But there's something more complicated still. So you are saying basically that I should conclude that she goes home early. Yes, okay, what you gave me so far is just you refuted my counter argument. But why should I overall conclude this? And this has to be now, this has to do with acceptability. This has to do with the rationale which is behind the consequence relation. So in other words, in our case, it has to do with argumentation semantics. We have to convince the person that the argument for home early, which we have presented, is overall acceptable. It's not just defend from one single attack, but it's overall acceptable. And how we do that is, for instance, by if we have the grounded semantics, for instance, the very simple semantics, then we can simply state the attack tree. The attack tree has to be rooted in a node which doesn't have an attacker anymore. So if we have such an attack tree, then it should be a convincing way of arguing for global acceptability. Of course, for other semantics, it may look slightly different, for instance, for stable semantics. So these are different ways an explainee could ask a question to the explainer. And this should find its way, and now you can't read that, but that's not a problem. It's just, I show you how this can in general look like. So such a dialogue protocol basically tells you how the interactions between the explainee and the explainer work out. So in green, you see always the question, why should I conclude phi? And in blue is the statements, the answers which the explainer provides. And what you see here in the different areas are the different types of queries which could be asked. So there's dialectic explanation when I give counter arguments to counter arguments, the illative explanation when I provide support to my argument, when I state an argument, I provide the reasons, and I provide a proof, the warrant of the argument. And then there is something more global, the explanation of overall acceptability of an argument, and that has to do with argumentation semantics. Here it's for stable, that's why it looks a bit more complicated. This has, of course, to do with those who know a little bit about formal argumentation. This has to do with dialogue games for different semantics. So this is how explanations work out. And now the last topic I will not go through anymore because otherwise I'm running totally out of time, but you can ask me about dynamic proofs if you're interested. So I thank you very much for your attention, but I will go to my last slide. You see, I had some other stuff. There's, of course, there's follow-up work, but ask me about it if you're interested in these things. We're always looking for other collaborators. I just say thanks to everyone for the nice opportunity and for your attention. And now I'm looking forward to your questions.